for a researcher, there's nothing better than seeing people run with your ideas and try to make change with it.
As you can tell, there's two things unions really want. One is to understand more about education, development and training, and the other is to know more about native birds of Australia and New Zealand. So I'm going to give a bird's eye view on education and development of delegates in unions. It'll draw on a report we did for the ACT, Rowan May and I, who's been an academic at Griffith University as well. And it's a project we call the Australian Union Delegates Project, commissioned by the ACTU. It was essentially looking at the state of play with delegate education and development. We did 28 semi-structured interviews across 9 unions, mix of blue and white collar, people at different levels, from leadership to educators and organisers, and basically about a year ago. And that was all qualitative research, but we also built on some quantitative research that I've been involved in with various people over the past couple of decades, really. So, now the key question is, what do we know from this research? Well, one of the key points is a policy recommendation for unions about the education development planning and processes. 3 things really to put a lot of attention on. The first is to ensure that the training of delegates is relevant and where appropriate. It's not always appropriate for it to be so like economics for units or whatever, but where it's meant to be relevant, then it needs to be very relevant, designed to tap right into what delegates will actually be doing in the workplace, not just sort of theoretical stuff. Organisers should make contact with the delegates, especially after classroom sessions, and do so purposefully, helping delegates learn on the job and informally how to apply the lessons from the classroom. Follow up. And organisers should also ensure that delegates have contact with other delegates. You set up formal processes, again, to reinforce the lesson from the classroom, and also to reinforce what the delegates themselves learn from the organiser. So it's no surprise that education development activities promote union membership growth and activism, but those things need resources, and they need resourcing by union leaders. And coordination within the people involved in this is very important. It's very important in delegate education and training that there's coordination between the participants. I'll talk about that shortly. But also coordination through the development of networks. I mentioned that a second ago, that networks that delegates are involved in that cut across the movement and indeed beyond the union movement build power. Delegates who are part of networks, that they have been involved in networks that are formalised, they've got a name basically, and that are external to the workplace. They're not just mixing with the delegates in their own workplace. Those delegates have more power than the others who don't. Continuing on this theme of coordination, the organiser and the educator need to work together, and it's always been a problem in following up. The training in the classroom has been done by the educator. The follow-up is typically the response of the organiser. Well, they need to work together. It's not a question of getting the organiser sitting in the classroom, hearing boring what the educator is teaching the delegates they all know all about. But we found from some of the unions that a key way in which they do get this coordination is by having co-design. The organiser and the educator are co-involved in design of the delegates education program. And this relates to the fact that delegates' success in the workplace depends in no small part on what they work from the organisers, not just in the classroom, but from the organisers, not just following up from the classroom, that's really important, but other informal processes, the delegate being shown how to do or what to do. So one of the key ideas is don't be a galah. Don't ignore follow-up. It's really integral. It's not additional. You can't sort of say, oh, we'll train 500 delegates and we've only got the resources to follow up 100. Well, you're wasting your money on the other 400. If you've got to think about and follow up as the integral part of a delegate education and training program. If you haven't got the resources to do follow-up, you've got to think about, okay, how do we design it best to be better? Because we can't do training and development without follow-up. It's not going to work. So it should be incorporated into the planning for training, and organisers need to be involved in that training and education. So there's a bit of a conceptual framework here, putting up at the end, of how delegates learn. And some of this stuff, you know, we're doing pretty well. There's like that big yellow sphere about learning through classroom training, and there's the big blue sphere about learning through the organiser, and then there's that red sphere, which is where delegates learn stuff from other delegates through interactions with other delegates. But these things have overlaps. We've got to think about how to make those overlaps work. Like the sort of greening, that, you know, overlap between yellow and blue, where you're learning from the organiser and through training. That's where you've got organisers involved in the follow-up of what's going on in the classroom, and that's a critical point. The purpley bit, where the organisers are involved in setting up networks for delegates, and that's a really important mechanism, and we call that formal delegate networks. And there's also the orangey bit about informal delegate networking in classes. So there are still gaps, we found. Not as big gaps as, you know, a decade or so ago, but there's still gaps in this organiser follow-up of training. This interaction between what goes on in the classroom, what goes on in the relationship between the delegate and the organiser. There's still gaps there, they shouldn't be there, and you know, it's no good pretending you can't see it, as my friend Mr. Duck would like to do. But perhaps the biggest gaps are now here in this overlap between the delegate interaction and the role of the organiser. That is, in setting up formal networks that involve delegates and that go beyond just the one workplace. There's been a lot of brain power, a lot of resources put into following up of training, but there's still stuff to do in terms of formally promoting these networks that we still think are quite important.